The first sign was the smoke, a thread so thin against the pewter sky it was almost nothing. Jacob paused, his snowshoes sinking into the crusted snow, and watched it rise from the gut of the ravine. He had been trapping this territory for 3 years and knew every deadfall, every game trail, every frozen creek bed. He had never seen smoke here. Not in this forgotten crease of the mountains where the pines grew so thick they choked out the sun and the rocks were slick with a perpetual coat of moss. The ravine was a dead end, a place things fell into and did not come out of. He shifted the weight of the pelts on his back, the cold air burning his lungs. A squatter, maybe. A man on the run. But the smoke was wrong. It was too careful, a pale exhalation rather than a hearty plume, as if whoever lit the fire was asking the forest to keep it secret. His dog, a lean hound, gave a low whine, its nose twitching. Jacob placed a hand on its head to quiet it. He moved off his trail, circling wide, using the dense timber for cover, his steps deliberate and silent. The snow muffled everything, but as he drew closer, another sound reached him, rhythmic and sharp. A clean, splitting sound. Thwack. A pause. Thwack. Someone was chopping wood. Not the desperate hacking of a lost traveler, but the steady, measured work of someone who knew the grain, who knew how much effort to spend and how much to save. He crept to the lip of the ravine and peered down through a screen of snow-laden branches. Below, nestled against a sheer rock face that protected it from the worst of the winds, was a cabin. It was small, no bigger than a hunter's lean-to, but it was solid. The logs were notched with a surprising precision, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and moss that had frozen solid. A roof of heavy sod sloped down, almost disappearing into the landscape. It was a thing of earth and wood, built not just to endure the winter, but to become part of it. And then he saw her. A woman, her form made bulky by layers of worn wool, was standing over a chopping block. She raised a heavy axe, its steel a flat grey in the winter light, and brought it down with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. Beside the cabin's low doorway, a large German shepherd sat on its haunches, its gaze fixed on the woods, a silent, watchful guardian. The dog's head lifted, its ears swiveling in his direction. It did not bark. It simply watched, a low growl vibrating in its chest. The woman stopped her work, her head turning slowly, her eyes searching the shadows where he stood. He held his breath, hidden and yet feeling utterly exposed. It had ended not with a storm but with a quiet signature on a piece of paper. Mr. Davies, the man from the bank, did not look at her as he folded the document and tucked it into his coat. His face was a mask of professional detachment, his movements precise and unhurried. He had stood on her porch, the same porch where her husband had died 2 winters before, and calmly explained the mechanics of foreclosure. He spoke of ledgers and liabilities, of droughts and market prices, his words as dry as the dust that settled on the worn floorboards. Anna watched him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, feeling the rough texture of her apron. The dog, Fen, lay at her feet, his body a tense line of muscle, his low growl a counterpoint to the banker's smooth voice. The property will be occupied by the new titleholder at the end of the month, Mr. Davies had said, finally meeting her eyes for a brief, uncomfortable second. His own were pale, like water that had been left to stand too long. He cleared his throat. You will be expected to have vacated the premises by then. He did not ask where she would go. It was not part of the transaction. She simply nodded, a single, sharp movement of her head. He tipped his hat, a gesture of hollow courtesy, and walked to his horse. She stood there long after the sound of his horse's hoofs had faded, listening to the silence he left behind. The farm was no longer hers. The fields, the barn, the small house her husband had built with his own hands, they were just lines on a map in a file in the bank's office. She looked at her hands, the skin calloused from years of work, and felt a stillness settle over her. It was not despair. It was something colder, harder. It was the quiet, terrifying clarity that comes when everything has been stripped away. Fen nudged his head against her leg, whining softly. She dropped her hand to his ruff, her fingers sinking into the thick fur. The house was full of ghosts, full of memories that now felt like trespassers. She would not stay to see them evicted. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a single candle for light, planning. The world had taken her life, so she would build a new one where the world could not find her. Her preparations were methodical, born of a pragmatism that had been honed by years of lean harvests and harsh winters. She moved through the house with a quiet purpose, sorting the remnants of her life into two piles, what she could carry and what she would leave behind. The heavy furniture, the wedding china, the faded photograph on the mantelpiece, they belonged to a person who no longer existed. She chose tools instead. Her husband's felling axe, its handle worn smooth by his grip. A buck saw. A heavy mallet and a pouch of iron nails she'd found in the barn. From the kitchen, she took a single cast iron pot, a knife, and a tin of salt. She packed the last of her flour and beans into canvas sacks. Her most prized possession was a thick quilt, its colors faded but its stitching still strong. She rolled it tight and secured it with rope. The last item was a small, locked wooden box containing the meager sum of money she had kept hidden from the bank's ledgers. The next morning, she walked the 5 miles to town, Fen trotting silently at her heel. The general store was quiet, smelling of dust and dried goods. Samuel, the proprietor, watched her from behind the counter as she moved through the aisles. He was a man of few words, his observations keen and his judgments kept to himself. She bought a length of strong rope, a sack of oats, a small bag of coffee, and 24 candles. It was a strange collection of goods for a woman who had just lost her home. Samuel tallied the cost, his movement slow. "Hard times, Anna," he said, his voice low. It was not a question. "Times are what they are," she replied, her own voice flat. She counted out the coins onto the counter, her hand steady. He looked from the coins to her face, his gaze lingering on the determined set of her jaw. He saw the absence of fear, the unnerving calm in her eyes. He knew what the bank had done. He had seen it happen to others. They usually broke, or they left the territory entirely. But Anna was different. He saw the flicker of a plan in her eyes, a resolve as hard as winter iron. He added a small whetstone to her pile of goods. "For the axe," he said, pushing it toward her. No charge. She met his gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Samuel." It was the only moment of kindness she had been shown, and it felt more significant than he could ever know. She gathered her supplies and left without another word, the bell over the door marking her departure. Samuel watched her go, a tall, solitary figure walking back toward the hills, the big dog her only shadow. He had a feeling he would not be seeing her again. She did not wait for the end of the month. 2 days later, under the cover of a moonless night, she left the farm for the last time. She did not look back. With Fen leading the way, she followed the creek that bordered her former property, moving deeper into the unclaimed woods that stretched for miles into the mountains. She walked all night, her pack heavy on her shoulders, the tools clanking softly with each step. The terrain grew rougher, the path disappearing into a tangle of undergrowth and rock. She knew these woods. In better times, she and her husband had walked them, mapping the streams and ridges in their minds. He had shown her the hidden places, the hollows and dells the loggers and hunters never bothered with. One place in particular had stayed in her memory, a deep, narrow ravine carved into the side of a steep hill, almost completely obscured by a rockslide on one side and a thick grove of old-growth pines on the other. It was a flaw in the landscape, a place easily missed. By dawn, she had found it. The air in the ravine was still and cold, the silence profound. A trickle of clear water ran along the base of the far wall, disappearing under a jumble of stones. The ground was rocky but level in one corner, sheltered by a massive overhang of granite. It was perfect. Hidden, defensible, with water and a seemingly endless supply of wood from the surrounding forest. She dropped her pack, the sound muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it made her knees weak. She sank to the ground, her back against a fallen log, and pulled the quilt around her shoulders. Fen rested his head on her lap, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. For the first time since Mr. Davies had ridden away, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was utterly alone, with nothing but a handful of tools and her own strength standing between her and the coming winter. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, went through her. But as she looked around the hidden space, at the silent, ancient trees and the unyielding stone, something else took root. This place owed nothing to any bank. It answered to no man's law. It was a place of raw, unforgiving honesty. Here, survival was the only currency. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. It was a small, hard thing, but it was hers. The work began that same day. Her first task was to fell the trees, a process that was brutal in its simplicity. She chose young, straight pines from the thickest part of the grove, trees small enough for one person to manage. The rhythmic swing of the axe became the new meter of her days. The shock of the blade biting into wood traveled up the handle, vibrating through her hands and arms, until her entire body ached with a deep, thrumming fatigue. At first, her swings were clumsy, her aim uncertain. She wasted energy, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But slowly, she found a rhythm. She learned to read the lean of the tree, to make the wedge of her cut precise. The sharp, clean scent of pine sap filled the air. When a tree finally groaned and began to fall, she would step back, her heart pounding, and watch it crash to the forest floor. Fen was her constant companion, a silent observer and a vigilant guard. He would lie near the edge of her work area, his ears perpetually scanning the surrounding woods. Any unfamiliar sound, the snap of a twig, the call of a distant bird, brought him instantly to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was her early warning system, her only defense against the unknown. After felling a tree, the even harder work of stripping and cutting the logs began. Using the bucksaw was a grueling, repetitive motion that strained the muscles in her back and shoulders. Sawdust clung to her clothes and hair. Her hands, soft from years of mending and kneading dough, were soon raw with blisters. She tore strips from her spare shirt to wrap them, but the wood was unforgiving. The skin broke, bled, and eventually hardened into thick calluses. She worked from the first light of dawn until the failing light of dusk forced her to stop. Evenings were spent by a small, carefully managed fire, eating a meager meal of boiled oats and tending to her aching body. She would sit with Fen pressed against her side for warmth, the vast, silent darkness of the forest all around them. In those moments, the enormity of her task threatened to overwhelm her. But then she would look at the growing pile of trimmed logs, each one a testament to her labor, and the feeling would pass. Each log was a victory. Each one was a stone in the foundation of her new life. Raising the walls was a battle of leverage and will. Without another person to help lift and place the heavy logs, she had to devise her own methods. She used the natural slope of the ravine to her advantage, rolling the logs downhill to her building site. To lift them into place, she constructed a crude but effective ramp and used her new rope, looping it around the logs and pulling, her body straining with the effort. It was a slow, agonizing process. A single log could take her half a day to move and set. The corners were the most difficult part, requiring her to notch the logs so they would lock together. She had watched her husband do it once, years ago, and she dredged the memory from the corners of her mind, trying to replicate his precise, confident cuts. Her first attempts were clumsy, the notches too shallow or too deep. But she learned from her mistakes, her movements becoming more certain with each log she shaped. The four walls rose with excruciating slowness, a ragged but sturdy rectangle against the stone backdrop of the ravine. The structure looked small, almost insignificant against the vast wilderness, but to her, it was a fortress. The roof presented the greatest challenge. She laid a series of smaller logs across the top of the walls, then covered them with a dense layer of pine boughs to create a thick thatch. Over this, she packed a heavy layer of sod and earth that she dug from the side of the ravine. The weight of it would help anchor the structure, and the thickness would provide insulation against the coming cold. The final piece of the cabin was the fireplace. She spent a week carefully selecting and hauling flat stones from the creek bed, fitting them together to build a hearth and chimney against the back wall of granite. She used a thick slurry of mud and clay as mortar, packing it into every crevice to make it as airtight as possible. The first time she lit a fire inside, the smoke drew poorly, filling the small space and making her eyes water. She had to dismantle part of the chimney and rebuild it, widening the flue. When she tried again, the smoke curled upwards and disappeared into the sky. She sat on the hard-packed earth floor, the warmth of the fire on her face, and watched the flames dance. It was the first real warmth she had felt in weeks. The cabin was complete. It was crude, dark, and small, with a single opening for a door and another small square cut into the wall, covered by a piece of stretched deer hide she had found and cured. But it was hers. She had built it with her own 2 hands. The first snow came without warning, a fine dusting of white that transformed the forest overnight. It was a beautiful sight, but it carried a chilling message: her time was running out. The cabin was built, but she was not yet ready for the deep winter. Her primary concern now was firewood. She spent every daylight hour working, felling more trees and sawing them into manageable lengths. She stacked the wood against the sheltered side of the cabin, the pile growing into a formidable wall that promised warmth through the darkest months. Her food supply was dangerously low. The flour and oats were dwindling, and she knew she could not survive on grains alone. She began setting snares along the game trails that crisscrossed the woods above the ravine. Her first few attempts were failures: the rabbits were too cunning, the squirrels too quick. But she persisted, observing the animals' habits, learning to place her wire loops in just the right spots. One morning, she found a large rabbit in one of her snares. Her relief was quickly followed by the grim reality of what she had to do. She had killed chickens on the farm, but this felt different. This was not husbandry, it was raw survival. She dispatched the animal quickly, her hand shaking slightly as she worked. That night, she cooked the rabbit in her iron pot, the smell of roasting meat filling the small cabin. The meal was a feast, a vital infusion of strength and protein. It was also a turning point. She was no longer just a builder, she was a hunter, a provider. The isolation, once a source of fear, was now becoming a source of strength. The silence of the forest was no longer empty, it was filled with the sounds of her own existence, the chop of her axe, the crackle of her fire, the soft breathing of her dog. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, she settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the seasons. She was becoming as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the stones. One evening, sitting by the fire, she ran her hand over Fenn's head, his warm presence a comfort in the deepening twilight. She looked at the sturdy log walls, the hearth glowing with life, and a profound sense of peace settled over her. This small, hidden place was more of a home than the farmhouse had ever been. The tracks appeared one morning after a fresh snowfall. They were large, made by a man's boots, and they ran parallel to the ravine, less than 50 yards from its edge. Anna's heart seized in her chest. She followed them for a short distance, her body tense, Fenn trotting silently beside her. They were the tracks of a single person, moving with a long, steady stride. A trapper, most likely. Someone who knew the woods as well as she did. The discovery shattered her sense of security. Her sanctuary had been breached, even if unknowingly. From that day on, she lived with a new level of caution. She became a ghost in her own home. She let her fire die down to embers during the day, enduring the biting cold of the cabin rather than risk sending a plume of smoke into the air. She moved through the woods like a shadow, checking her snares only at dawn and dusk, her feet silent on the snow. Fenn seemed to understand the new danger. He rarely left the immediate vicinity of the cabin, and his watchfulness intensified. He would spend hours lying in the snow near the ravine's edge, a silent, grey sentinel, his gaze fixed on the woods. The trapper, Jacob, became a persistent, unseen threat. She found his tracks again a week later, this time closer to the creek. Once, she heard the distant, metallic snap of one of his traps being sprung. The sound sent a jolt of fear through her, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. She began to feel like a hunted animal, constantly on edge, her senses sharpened to an almost painful degree. Every gust of wind in the pines, every cry of a jay, could be a sign of his approach. The solitude she had come to cherish was now tainted with fear. She was not afraid of the man himself, but of what he represented, the outside world, the laws and claims of men, the possibility that her hidden life could be discovered and taken from her just as her old one had been. She reinforced the hide covering on her small window opening, blocking out the light, and kept the heavy plank door barred at all times. The cabin became a dark, womb-like space, a refuge from the world outside and a prison of her own making. The quiet intensity of her existence was stretched taut, the silence no longer peaceful but filled with a waiting tension. The blizzard arrived in the night, a wall of wind and snow that descended on the mountains with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked through the pines, a sound like a great beast in its death throes. Snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin, sealing her inside. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. The world outside her door was a churning vortex of white, all sense of time and direction lost. Inside the small, dark space, Anna and Fen huddled by the fire. She kept it burning steadily, feeding it from her precious woodpile. The flames were her only source of light and her only defense against the life-sapping cold that seeped through the chinks in the walls. The constant howl of the wind was a physical presence, pressing in on the small structure. She felt the vibrations through the log walls, a reminder of the immense, indifferent power of the wilderness. Trapped in the darkness, with nothing to do but wait, her thoughts turned inward. The memories of her past life surfaced, but they felt distant now, like scenes from someone else's story. She saw her husband's face, not with the sharp pang of grief she had once felt, but with a gentle, quiet sadness. She remembered the warmth of her farmhouse kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the feel of the sun on her face as she worked in the garden. These things were gone, and she finally understood that she could not get them back. But in their place was something new. Something forged in solitude and hardship. She thought of the axe in her hands, the weight of the logs on her shoulders, the satisfaction of a well-set snare. She had discovered a strength within herself she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just a widow, a victim of circumstances. She was a survivor. A builder. She was the woman who had carved a life out of the wilderness with nothing but her own will. The storm outside was a terrifying force, but it could not touch her here. In the heart of the blizzard, sealed in the home she had made, she felt an unshakable sense of peace. She had been tested, and she had not broken. When she finally pushed open the door, the world was blindingly white and utterly silent. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow. The air was crystalline and so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowed. Her woodpile was dwindling, and she knew she needed to venture out. She took the axe and began the arduous task of clearing a path out of the ravine. The work was slow, but the physical exertion felt good, a reaffirmation of her own strength after days of confinement. She built a small fire, carefully using the driest wood she could find to minimize the smoke, a habit now deeply ingrained. A thin, pale wisp curled up into the still morning air. It was this smoke that Jacob saw from the ridge. He made his way down, drawn by a curiosity that had been nagging at him for weeks. He moved with the quiet tread of a hunter, his presence a ghost in the silent woods. As he reached the edge of the ravine, he stopped, concealed by the snow-laden branches of a large fir. He saw the cabin, its sod roof a small, dark mound against the vast white. It looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself. Then he saw her. She was splitting firewood, her movements efficient and strong. The axe rose and fell with a steady rhythm. The German shepherd sat near the doorway, and as if sensing his presence, it lifted its head, its dark eyes fixing on his hiding place. It let out a single, low growl, not of aggression, but of warning. The woman paused, her hand resting on the axe handle, and she turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the lip of the ravine. Her eyes met the spot where he stood. He could not see her face clearly, but he felt the force of her stare, the quiet defiance in her posture. He saw the sturdy cabin, the neat stack of wood, the silent dog, and the solitary woman, and he understood. This was not a place he had discovered. It was a place he had stumbled upon, a place that was not meant for him. It was a world complete unto itself. He remained motionless for a long moment, a silent witness to her impossible existence. Then, slowly, carefully, He backed away, making no sound, leaving no trace of his intrusion. He turned and walked away, his snowshoes whispering on the fresh snow, leaving the woman and her hidden home to the vast, silent peace of the winter. Anna watched the space where he had been, her breath misting in the frigid air. When she was sure he was gone, she turned back to her work, lifted the axe, and brought it down again, the clean sound of splitting wood echoing in the quiet ravine.